There are people here, and Talrevich is on air with us, and Nadia as well. Vasily, I will definitely comment on what you just said in a moment. What do I want to start with? Of course, right now the number one topic on the agenda is the information about this gang called the SCO. In the future, we can call them that, a communist gang that is planning to destroy the entire civilized world. And you can see who is in this company. In this company, there is the communist with a one-party communist fascist system, Xi. In this company, there is the Kivanist Putin, who started the war, and of course, China is involved here as well. He is deeply interested in destroying both the entirety of Europe and the whole of America, which should also be significantly involved in this crucial process. And in general, this particular ideology of one belt, one road truly reminds me more of a constricting collar around the very neck of civilization, indeed around the neck of the entire Western world. So what do we have today? If before the globalists, the social globalists, tried to take everything over and create a global world with this so-called golden billion, now Xi has taken the lead in this process. In other words, China. You could say that China has already bent those European socialists to its will and is starting to dominate. And this is how it always happens. That is, under socialism and communism, first someone takes the lead, occupies a certain position, then they destroy their opponents, and then those opponents destroy the next ones. In the end, it all ends with gulags, wars, destruction, and so on. That's why what happened today with this SCO gathering, this rebel under the auspices of China, is clearly a test run, an attempt to establish socialism and communism worldwide. And on the other hand, we titled our stream as the battle between Trump's American conservative world and the Chinese one-party system. This is what's happening globally at the moment. But in this situation, Ukraine unfortunately has become a chessboard caught up in all of this. But on Trump's side, there is a desire, as a peace-loving person, a person with common sense, to stop this slaughter, to stop both Putin, the Kyivite, and China, and to create this one-party, or rather, as we called it, unipolar conservative world, which in the future could help other countries as well to put in place leaders who would be responsible for their country and their people, and who would build civilization rather than destroy the world. That's what's happening at the moment. But I believe that this pressure that Trump put on India, and he immediately responded by imposing a 50% tariff, this is a struggle for Ukraine. The primary motive for Trump to impose these tariffs, which are not very beneficial for America as they disrupt business processes and business logistics. But Trump did this because he wants to stop the war. And at the moment, there are no other options. And there is no one who would defend Ukraine's interest to stop the hostilities and the war in the future. There just isn't. That's why support from Trump is absolutely necessary. Let me answer a question here. Darius wrote, good afternoon, Oleg. I've been a long-time subscriber of Dennis. I actively promoted Donald Trump among my family and friends. I tried to refute media questions about him and so on. Now, is it possible that we might have to, this is a question, argue a bit more about the events at the SCO itself? People ask me questions like, so what about the great Trump? Do you know what to say or not? But the thing is, over the past 40 or 50 years, this socialism of the mind has become so pervasive. It's a cancer that has spread to every country. And the Stripocrats have only intensified this situation in every country. Trump now, in just about 6 months, has practically turned this huge ship of common sense around and is heading in the opposite direction, pushing back against the socialists and communists of Europe, pushing back against the socialists and communists of China. And at the moment, I'm sure India will also come under fire. So there is movement, and I think right now he's in a position like a lion ready to pounce. At the moment, as you know, Venezuela is completely surrounded by these large military ships. So there too, I think the right processes will soon take place to detect and eliminate Maduro. Are offering $50 million for his capture because he comes from such a beautiful, powerful country that has all the resources and oil. And in terms of production, it's in second or third place. And yet to ruin the country so badly that people are literally starving with terrible things happening there. This is what happens when society doesn't resist. Eventually you end up with such a terrible situation. The same thing happened with Russia. The same thing is now happening with Europe, and the same thing is happening with Ukraine. Because Ukraine, over 30 years under the pressure of the Kiev authorities and Soros-style socialists, has now ended up in such a difficult situation. So here, I have to answer from the very beginning. Darius wrote to me, and here, Natalia Vasilievna, hello. I no longer have any doubts. The war will drag on. Unfortunately, now is not the time for peace. I understand that the masks are off. They've shown the power of cinnamon. We're waiting for Trump to pull India in. Well, that's exactly what Trump is doing because he imposed a 50% tariff. And believe me, Modi, who is already in his third term in power, has decided, just like Putin and Xi, to stay in power even longer. So this is a kind of mania. Why shouldn't people be allowed to stay in politics for too long? Because they become unhealthy individuals. And as of today, this Modi, his mind isn't all there anymore either. Because he's willing to make alliances even with his sworn enemy, China, and also with Pakistan, just to stay in power. There's no other motivation there. And dictators, for the sake of power, are always ready to burn or kill their own people. They don't care about the number of people who die in such situations. Sergei writes, but China is uniting a series of its allies while Trump is dividing them. That's a completely wrong way of thinking. I believe that Trump is actually uniting people with common sense and countries that want to be free. At the moment, there aren't many of them. So what do we have? In Latin America, there's Javier Milei, then Onyapki, on that isthmus of Latin America. And now Trump represents the conservative wing. And on the other side, from Europe, well, just count who they have there. Israel is now fighting for its very existence. Then I think they'll finish off Gaza, and in the end, there will be a Riviera there, just as Trump said. The same thing is happening. Ukraine is trying to hold on in this difficult situation where the Democrats have sold out Ukraine. First, they pushed it into war, and then through Lend-Lease, they stopped the supply of weapons. That's always how they operate, and it's the same situation right now. But I'm sure that Trump will now put pressure on both India and China, and no matter how much China puffs up its cheeks with its One Belt, One Road initiative, Trump has already cut off its tentacles, and in this area, you could say it's starting to disappear altogether. The only influence he probably keeps feeding is Lula in Brazil. This socialist communist with whom I think there should be elections there next year or the year after, I'm sure that the conservative wing of America will support Bolsonaro, and there will also be a pro-conservative president there. So that's Latin America and North America as well. I think it will even reach Canada, and eventually he'll drive those socialists out of there, but he will definitely help Europe too. Because this superstructure, the socialist one, called the European Union, led by Ursula, is definitely a noose around the neck of European countries. And look how it turned out. They created the European Union, and after that, almost all the economic burden was carried by Germany, France, and Italy. And the European Union kept expanding at the expense of Eastern European countries. But it turns out that the money collected from these productive countries, Germany, Italy, France, was redistributed to this socialist camp of Europe for building roads, infrastructure, and so on. At whose expense was this done? It was at the expense of the taxpayers of Germany, France, and Italy. And these so-called polosocrats arrange things in such a way that they first create some kind of system, then each of them, in their own way, exploits their people and redistributes these resources. I believe that every country should, if it has chosen its own leader, then that leader should be responsible for developing their own country. And all these megastructures were deliberately created by socialists and communists in order firstly to install their puppets through pseudo-elections, and then through these Euro commissions to rob each country individually. And you saw that whole circus with Ursula, where they landed a plane, and there was something about some radars. Just look at the reality of it all. All of this is done deliberately, purely for PR, because she needs publicity. She needs to be in the public eye. She needs to be recognizable, because she plans to become the president of Germany. Just imagine this deadly combination. Merz, who can't manage the economy at all, the only thing he can do is convert car factories to produce shells, basically putting the country on a war footing. That's how it turns out. And then there's Ursula on top of that. And so the two of them will be in charge together. All right, let's see what we have here. A question in Ukrainian. Well, the thing is, I want to repeat once again that 50 years of socialism have completely drained people's brains, whether in Europe, America, Latin America, or in Russia, where the KGB seized power while China has been building up its strength. And this is still the same problem, because the American socialists, through their policies, have always acted in such a way that the economy would move to other developing countries. And now they've shouted themselves hoarse, and China has become so powerful that now they have to go to war with it. In other words, as always, they first create the problem, and now they're going to pretend that they're doing something to solve it. But in reality, China was advancing by leaps and bounds, and in fact, its plans included gradually taking over Europe, America, Latin America, and Africa. And let me tell you, basically after the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 to 1945, what happened in America was the creation of the IMF and the World Bank. Currently, China's share of influence over the World Bank and the IMF is about 5 to 6%. But just 10 or 20 years ago, it was 3% and so on. In other words, it has been steadily rising. But China has grown so much economically by now that it has started to invest on its own, like an international World Bank. It is also beginning to invest in other countries. But the principle is the same: drive countries into debt and then take their resources. This is what it has done in Africa, in Asia, and in other countries. In other words, exactly the same principle as the IMF. And now you could say they are competing with each other. And now, at this moment, the entire political game and the whole situation that is unfolding can be viewed through the lens of the struggle between the World Bank, that is, the bankers who have long seized power in many countries around the world, and communist China. But today, the conservative wing of America has taken power into its own hands and, in principle, wants to restore order here. The same goes for the Federal Reserve, which you could say is located on American soil, as are the IMF and the World Bank. But from time to time, they implemented policies that made absolutely no sense and did not serve the interests of the United States either. But today, this situation is being corrected. I still believe that Trump will push both Putin and Zelensky, and that this three-way meeting will eventually take place. It won't be a bilateral meeting anymore because there's no point in having a KGB man sit down with a globalist. They won't agree on anything. A conservative needs to sit down here, grab them by the scruff, make them sit, and say, this is how it's going to be. So put an end to this whole war frenzy and stop this slaughter. So the processes are underway. Greetings, Oleg. Surge95, wishing you a great broadcast. Yes, thank you, Trump. Nothing will help. You are mistaken. I'm telling you, Trump is doing everything to stop the slaughter. That's the wrong way of thinking. And how much of America? We've got all sorts of bots here. Vladimir, yes, you won't hear the truth. The only truth is that America and Russia jumped out at me. Ukrainian authorities, Jews, do you know why there's a trade war going on? I've always been against all that. Assigning labels, saying Jews are Ukrainians or Poles or any other nationality, it doesn't matter at all. Either the system is set up so that a person has friends and common sense, or it tries to direct things along lines of race, religion, or nationality. It only creates a bigger problem. In the end, socialists are interested in people fighting among themselves over whether someone is Jewish or not, or whether someone is Ukrainian or Polish. They drop these hints just to divide people and stay in power. People need to use their brains. They need to unite. That's why we go on air, so that people with common sense can stay united and not let themselves be deceived. A question from Lutsk. Socialism built hospitals, universities, and all sorts of nonsense. The communists write. Socialists can set things up and manage in such a way that, in the end, it always leads to collapse and their own destruction. And what's more, this destruction doesn't even come from outside, but from within. Everything is heading in that direction. That's why, right now, why is everyone so afraid of Trump? Why are all the countries so afraid? Because these unified structures that exist in Europe, Asia, or other countries, they understand that if Trump shows that that the leader can be on the side of society and not the bureaucrats, that doesn't suit them. Because what suits them is their own bureaucratic and very often fascist organization, which doesn't take into account the opinion of the people at all. It simply isn't considered. And what the Democratic Party is planning right now is to win this election. In fact, I think the next step is to say that the next elections aren't needed at all because we always win, meaning we're always right. And that's exactly where China would come into play. Moreover, it has a special landing spot, California, with this Newton, with this monster. I think the Californians themselves are already dreaming of the day when this freak will finally leave them alone so they can focus on their own state. Trump is also putting pressure on the socialists in America. And, the situation in Chicago is very complicated right now. Trump is planning to send the National Guard there. Yesterday, I did a stream with Alex Verdutsky. You can check it out. He actually lives right in downtown Chicago, and he talked about what the situation is like there. And there, the mayor is a black socialist, plus there's Pritzker, who, as you know, is from the Pritzker family. By the way, they own Hyatt, I think, the company that runs all the mayor's hotels. They're very wealthy people, but at the same time, it often happens that wealthy people come to power just to stay in power. They're willing to bring in socialism, communism, chaos, even internal conflicts, just to hold on to power. But Trump, I'm sure, will send in troops there in a day or two and stop all this carnage, just like he did in Washington. And as you can see, the mayor of Washington is a Democrat, and a pretty tough one at that. And Trump brought in the National Guard, restored order, and now she's joined him, saying, yes, we restored order. So for them, switching sides on the fly is completely normal, and they only understand a position of strength. As soon as the Democrats or socialists sense that the Republicans or other opponents are showing even the slightest weakness, they're ready to finish them off and even physically destroy them. That's exactly what they wanted to do with Trump.